I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair at CSIS. I want to congratulate Texas A&M, the Bush School, and the Scowcroft Institute. This is a very consequential conference. This is my third time coming. It grows every year. I think the outcomes of this conference are consequential. They're taken very seriously in government, and so I want to congratulate. And I think this is Texas A&M and the Bush School and the Scowcroft Institute, because I think it's a very important conference, and that's why I'm here. I also want to congratulate Andrew Natsios. I think Andrew has been a prophet, whether it's been on North Korea, whether it's been on Sudan, whether it's been on food crises and food coups and now pandemics. Andrew has been a prophetic voice. And Andrew, as you know, I will follow you anytime, anywhere. I still work for you, and it's great to be here. So thank you, Andrew. I've got several points I want to make, and then we'll go to the panel. Can I get a show of hands? Does anybody in this room believe that the solution for preparedness and response to pandemics is only a government-to-government function? Does anyone here believe that? I'm just okay. I know seems like a slightly obtuse question, but I think because it seems to me that much of the thinking and much of the assumptions that goes into these conversations are very much a government-to-government conversation. So I suspect that's why we're having this panel. But if you think about the way we talk about it, or sort of our solution set or approach, it's very much. There's a reason we call it public health as opposed to private health, right? There's a component built into it. So I just think I want to kind of start with that as kind of like a jumping off point for this. I think there's several things I've taken away in preparation for this conversation. I'm going to give you the punchline first for what I think is going to come out of this panel. So I think there's at least two things. I suspect there may be some other things as well. I think the first is in terms of planning for preparation and response, we need to do a much better job as a system in opening up the conversation to the private sector. I think there's a lot of challenges to that, how we talk about it. I think there's significant distrust. I think some private sector actors, including the pharmaceutical industry, I like pharmaceutical companies, but some of them have a bad reputation, let's be honest. I think we'll get into that. And then I think there's some government folks that have a completely obtuse view of this and think it's only, and sort of operate in sort of a government-to-government mindset. So there's a mindset shift that needs to happen on that side too. So we need to open up, and we need to do a much better job of working together, I think, is the first point I would say. And that I also think includes tabletop exercises. The kinds of strategic, the deep dives that we do are often very government-to-government focused things. So I want to encourage you. So that's my punchline number one. I think punchline number two is something that the commissioner said earlier, that it was something that Richard Crespin and I talked about on the plane ride out here, is that we need to create the kinds of relationships ahead of time. We need relationships ahead of time. You cannot, in the middle of an Ebola crisis, try and knit together some sort of a partnership of any kind of, or it's quite difficult to do, whether it's a tsunami response or an emergency response or a pandemic response. You can't do it on the fly. It has to be ahead of time. And so I also am very encouraged that there are many private sector actors here as well. And I think this is a place to kind of to create kind of some of the violins and the moonlight for making beautiful music here. Okay, so those are my second point. Okay, so I think there's two questions I want to help see if we can answer in this conversation. One is, what does the private sector going to need from government? And what is government going to need from the private sector, which is the question I asked the commissioner earlier. And I've got two other points, and I'm gonna open it up to our panelists. I wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum on the role of different roles of stakeholders in the Ebola response, and this is what I wrote at the time, which is 4 years ago. What the role of business is in the Ebola response. And what I said was, charitable contributions are not necessarily the priority. So we shouldn't be thinking about companies as just sort of a CSR function only here. Instead, business innovation, business operations, and skilled volunteers are more urgently needed, as well as more protective equipment, which is often made by the private sector. West Africa needs a renewed focus on technological innovation and research into vaccines and cures. This is already underway at the time. and should be accelerated. Cash donations, sure, are welcome, but medical staff and airlift services are more practical. Airlines are important too. There's already been a marked decrease in flights to the then 3 countries most affected by Ebola. But travel is necessary as it keeps these countries connected to the rest of the world. Mining and agribusiness, both critical for a number of West African economies, should also explore ways to restore operations on the ground. So these are all things that we don't necessarily think about in a public health context, but in some of the comments that the commissioner made about a functioning society, these are all important as we think about a pandemic and sort of the wheels kind of grinding to a halt. That these have all sorts of other sorts of consequences as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn to the panel. But I know there's a series of questions some of the panelists I'm going to get to. But what I'd like to do is I want to first start with a question for each of the panelists, and I'm going to introduce them each briefly. Like, why did you end up? Why are we sitting at this stage? It's sort of not in an existential standpoint, or why what brings you to this conversation? I want to ask each of you this question. So I'm going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca, who are you? I know who you are, and then don't go into your full bio, but I know that you've been in the government and you've been in the private sector. You're now at a pharmaceutical company. Right. What brings you to this conversation?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate Jerry's invitation and the fact that private sector is even getting to engage in this manner, which doesn't always happen. So kudos to you for having the event in this manner. Probably my story starts a long time ago in the sense that I left college a long, long time ago with the plan to probably go to med school and be an infectious disease specialist. But I needed to pay off some school loans, so I took a job at this place called Merck. And I met this guy named Maurice Hilleman. And I hope that some of you in this room know who Maurice Hilleman is, because if you don't, you're probably at the wrong conference. But Maurice is credited with saving more lives than any scientist in the 20th century. Worked on vaccines including measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, chickenpox, pneumonia, and was heavily involved as well in influenza, particularly the 1957 pandemic. Maurice was retired and I was at the start of my career, but he would come into headquarters and he would take some of us out to lunch and he would tell us these incredible stories about the course of his career and what he had managed to achieve. And I think the real takeaway for me there was that you could achieve as much in the private sector as you could in the public sector, but that real success came when you were both working together. So that was sort of the impetus for this very long back and forth, but it all started with Maurice Hilleman at Merck.
Guy, thanks for being here. You're based in New York now?
In Washington.
In Washington, okay, good. So we'll have to get together. So Guy, you're at a family foundation. You're a scientist. So I asked you this question earlier today. You said, well, I said, what brings you here? And you're like, Dan, what do you mean by that? But so in sort of the larger sense, what brings you to this conversation?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the Scowcroft Institute, and the Bush School for inviting me. And I would also like to excuse my boss, Alain Mérieux, who was also invited, but unfortunately could not make the trip to College Station because of other commitments. So I'm a virologist by training, and I've spent most of my career working in the diagnostic field. And I think that diagnostics are usually not considered as they should be. It's a weak part in general of the health system, and I'm especially here because I want to again advocate for the importance of diagnostics in the preparedness and response to pandemics. The Mérieux family, if I can present the Fondation Mérieux briefly. So yeah. The Mérieux family is involved in the fight against infectious disease since the end of the 19th century. The Fondation Mérieux itself is helping resource-limited countries to strengthen their laboratory capacities, which is central in their health system and also in their capacity to detect outbreaks and prevent pandemics. We are a not-for-profit, family-owned foundation, which is an implementing foundation with teams and projects in about 30 countries. Most of them are Francophone countries, which which makes us, I think, quite specific. The Merieux family itself funds about half of the cost of these projects, and for the other half, we engage with private and public financial and technical partners to conduct them, and that's why that's also partly a response to your question: what do we expect from governments and the public sector? For us, the best way to combat epidemics and pandemics is to prepare health systems to rapidly identify an unexpected event, either a spillover or a re-emergence of a previously controlled disease. And laboratories and diagnostics are there to help epidemiologists and public health authorities to confirm unusual things they see in active or passive surveillance. This is very important because this inter-pandemic activities is able to identify partners, either local or international partners, who can then act more rapidly, not preparing things in a flight when a crisis occurs. This cannot be done if the lab-serving populations are not delivering a quality biology routinely, day to day. This cannot be done if countries do not have the capacity to implement all diagnostic technologies, from the simplest rapid tests or bacterial culture to the most sophisticated, such as deep sequencing. And this requires research, local research capacities. Fondation Merieux is working closely with governments, particularly in Francophone countries, to assess their capacities for biology at all levels of the health system, from the district to the Directorate of Laboratories of the Ministries of Health in capitals, and of course to help filling these gaps. Fondation Merieux also works with School of Medicines, with schools of pharmacy, with Ministries of Health, to build labs that allow scientists to conduct research on dangerous pathogens that matter for their country, test new technologies, and understand where pathogens circulate. A few words on two of our major programs. One is Rezao Lab. It's in West Africa, where we have included more than 1,000 private and public labs from 7 countries in a network, and provided them expertise on quality management, biosafety, biosecurity, specimen referral, lab management, data management, and data sharing for epidemiological purpose, surveillance of infectious disease, including antimicrobial resistance, policy, and country lab schemes supervision. The network has a regional component, and this is very important, associating country directors for laboratories and the West African Health Organization, WAHO. And because of the Ebola crisis, we have been especially focusing on Guinea, which is very late in its development for laboratories, where we have assessed labs and strengthened their capacities for specimen referral and biosafety capacities.
This is great. Were you involved with the Ebola response in Guinea?
Yes, we were.
Okay, great. Let me come back. I'm going to come back to you about this because I think this is really, I think it's going to be really interesting to hear about this. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Barry, thanks for being here. So you're an entrepreneur and a scientist. You're also now at iBio, or is it eBio or
iBio?
iBio. Thanks for being here. And tell us a little bit about why are you at what brings iBio and what brings you to this conversation?
There's a binary answer. One is personal and one is business. The reason I'm here is because I'm a serial entrepreneur in biotechnology, and I tell many people over a cocktail that means you have a double recessive gene for pain. You just don't feel it. You just keep hitting yourself in the head and say, let's build a bigger one next time and spend more money and it will be successful. Not a problem. So, and like Nicolas Cage said when he was standing next to Sean Connery on the rock, he said, I'm just a biochemist, man, and that's what I am. But we built a business here, which was a joint venture between us and the government. I talked about that yesterday as we were a DARPA project, a different sort of DARPA project in that it was a technology investment agreement. And that means that we put up hard cash. So we put up a third of a $60 million effort, my partners and I. And we made this joint venture. We proved that we could make 50 million doses of an H1 vaccine in 12 weeks from getting a gene sequence using our technology. And we built a commercial-sized facility. So a mile and a half away from here is a very big engine.
Oh, I've been to it. It's enormous. It's like it's like the Death Star of vaccine making.
It is.
It's great.
It is. But like I said,
in a good way. The good one.
But like I said yesterday, we declared victory in 2011 after we did this, and the government fell silent. We were never visited again. So my partner said yesterday, he said it was like we're the illegitimate child of a one-night stand between the public and the private sector. Oof. And I thought that was brilliant. But the other reason I'm here on this panel is because we believe as a company that our technology is best used to make things that are therapeutics that answer the call of all of the policy that we've heard in the last day or two. So we're on the make side of things. And we also believe that one of the best ways for especially emerging countries and places that have need is to empower them to do it. And our business model is to empower other people to use our technology. We're going to make it available. We are making it available, and we'll have this discussion, I'm sure, as we go along.
So Barry, do we have to have a scare for people to call you up? Is that
No, in
basically
fact,
what
nobody
happens?
calls us up. We have to go out and solicit business like everybody else. I do get visited by Homeland Security and the FBI once a year. We're the government, we're here to help. And we go on a tour, and we see them again. So are we a government-free zone? Probably, not by, somewhat by desire, but we embrace working with public institutions. It's just that we're a small business, and we think small business to small business globally is an effective tool. It's not the only tool, but it's effective. And as I say, as the panel, as we discuss or answer more questions, I'll be happy to talk about specifics.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so Richard, thanks for being here. I consider Richard to be one of the top multi-stakeholder partnership builders in the world, and so that is why I think Richard should be on this panel. But Richard, why don't you talk a little bit from your perspective of what brings you to this conversation?
Mostly to hear you say those words.
Absolutely.
As many times as possible.
The check's in the mail, I hope.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Howdy, y'all.
Howdy.
I'm a native New Mexican, so it's a little difficult for me to be up here. Here in Texas, in New Mexico, we used to say, problem in New Mexico is that it's too far from heaven and too close to Texas. But thank you all for having us here and for having me here. I really am happy to be here at Texas A&M. And I'm here because, because Dan invited me, and Dan said, whenever Andrew Natsios calls, you go. So thank you, Andrew, for having us here. Before I took up this job, running Collaborate Up, and our job is to try to bring together multiple sectors, multiple disciplines when they want to take on really tough problems. I used to run something called Corporate Responsibility Magazine and worked very closely with the New York Stock Exchange as those companies were rethinking their role in society in the wake of the Enron crisis and a crisis in confidence in corporate institutions. And what I observed when I was there as a member of the media was that as these companies would try to engage with civil society and try to engage with government, they were oftentimes talking past each other. And they were trying to say the same things, trying to work on the same problems, but there was just a lot of using of the same words but meaning different things, or using different words to mean the same things, and we wanted to come in and try to figure out if we could accelerate that collaboration. We've had the privilege since then to work on many slow-moving disasters like climate change and the decline of biodiversity, but also in the wake of disaster response and recovery from natural disasters. We were also involved in the corporate response to Ebola in the last outbreak, as well as working with USAID and other donors on trying to improve health systems interoperability for affected regions. So we've kind of looked both at the immediate response problems. We've been involved in those kind of last mile logistics, as well as with sort of the deeper but also more boring parts like data standards and data integrity.
Good. Okay. So let me just press you a little bit further, Richard. So you've been in this business a long time. When you look at this problem, this set of problems, if you had a magic wand, what would be the sorts of things you'd want to see this community do in terms of what kind of partnerships would you want to see happen, or what are some of the things you'd want to see happen between the public and the private sector as it in relation to pandemic preparedness or pandemic response?
Yeah, I'll pick up maybe 3 or 4 things. One comes right out of what you said at the top, is that we need to be more welcoming of outside disciplines. And oftentimes, if you study innovation science, innovations most often, big breakthroughs occur at the intersections of multiple disciplines or from people coming outside the field. Incremental improvements occur with experts talking to experts. So how do we invite other people, make it more inviting for other sectors and other disciplines to come in? As an example, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago on the West Coast with medical researchers, and we brought in some people from outside the field, and one of the presenters, she messed up her medical terminology. She kind of stumbled over some medical terms, and you could audibly hear the collective eye roll in the room as people sort of shut down and stopped listening to her, because she essentially lost credibility, even though she's not a medical researcher. She was there to talk about logistics and supply chain management. So I think figuring out how we can be more welcoming of outside thinking, particularly breakthrough thinking. I think we also need these sort of, you used a great term there, prepositioned agreements. I was reflecting on the commissioner's remarks. During the last pandemic, and the flu pandemic in 1918, the society was much smaller. It was much less specialized, and we were a lot more connected in ways that I don't think we're connected today. I think you could rely on having known people in the private sector because maybe you belong to the same clubs.
Social capital.
There's a lot more social capital built up. We're much more specialized than we used to be, so we need to figure out more informal and formal mechanisms for getting to know each other and being really comfortable working together in really effective ways. And then I think it takes some time to think about sort of these really boring things. One of my observations of people that work in pandemic response and disaster recovery and disaster response is that they're very driven by the immediacy of the crisis, and that after the immediacy goes away, for lots of reasons, the pressure goes away as well. And there's a lot of really deep and boring things like data standards, data dictionaries, data interoperability, systems interoperability. These things need to be really well thought out, and they take committees and meetings that a lot of us don't want to go to really work through.
Thank you. Okay, so Rebecca, you've been at both. You were in the private sector. You talked about that. Can you talk a little bit about how it taught you best to respond to future events?
I think one of the things I've noticed is that we tend to think of the private sector as a monolithic entity. We just describe it as the private sector, right?
Yeah.
It would be sort of like me saying, well, the CDC and the CIA are the same thing because they're both agencies. So I think one of the things that we need to do in the public sector is really understand that firms have unique capabilities and strengths. And a simple way to think of that is who does what well, right? In general, Welsh, I think, talked about this yesterday a bit from the defense perspective when he said, I need to know who has what materials, who can get it there, when it can be on the ground, and how fast that's going to happen. We need to know the same thing for the private sector, and it always strikes me as unusual that we don't have that sort of formal assessment of firm capabilities, and I think that would be one thing that would be very helpful to response. I also think we need to make it easy, as many of us have discussed here, for the private sector to engage. There's no on-ramp for industry, right? You don't know who to talk to, where to start, you don't know where to plug in, and there needs to be a better mechanism to do that. And unfortunately, some of the mechanisms that do exist might sound good to all of you, but if you're a private sector company, you may have to pay, for example, to join a private sector roundtable. That might cost $10,000 to $35,000 a year. That's going to be a deterrent if you're a small biotech startup, all right? You're not going to do that. We don't want to create additional disincentives for companies to come to the table and share their capabilities. And another thing that I really like about this meeting is that we have the opportunity to make formal policy recommendations. And I think one thing that would be very helpful We've talked a lot about having this sort of White House level person who coordinates preparedness. We haven't talked about who reports into that person. One thing that would be really helpful would be having a person who does nothing but coordinate with the private sector, so that you have a single point of contact, you know who to talk to, and that individual would be tasked with saying, I'm going to plug you into these different efforts. But we've got to make it easier for the private sector to be part of the preparedness enterprise and not have them kind of stumble and fumble around trying to figure out, is this helpful or should I talk to you? It's unfortunately too challenging, and I think the public sector needs to do a better job on that.
Okay, so Rebecca, I had the chance to speak with you earlier today. So there's some things that are kind of unglamorous about sort of the role of the private sector in some of these things. It's not as sexy as sort of, I don't know, sort of folks in white lab coats doing some unbelievable breakthrough. Some of it's moving stuff from one point to another. Could you just spend a minute talking about just the realities of moving stuff across borders, and what does that take, and what is that all about? Because that struck me as interesting and important to this discussion.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me is sometimes we come to these meetings and we want to talk about the big issues, like let's develop new incentives for a universal flu vaccine, right? Or new push-pull incentives.
Which is all legit. It's all,
Right.
that's legitimate part of the
Absolutely.
conversation. However,
But there's this part of it that we don't get to that's not as glamorous, where we can have a meaningful impact by tackling some of the smaller things. Like, for example, there are forms that will need to be signed in order to import-export product to different parts of the world. We know that now. We know we'll need to do it again. Why don't we sit down ever and actually walk through an exercise to figure out, in a hypothetical scenario, what is every piece of paper that is going to need to be filled out? And it wouldn't be fun, I'll be honest with you. But it's not just happening from the pharma company. I've heard an NGO talk about at WHO how many physicians they had ready to deploy. They were ready to go.
in an Ebola situation.
In the Ebola situation, they needed one piece of paper, and they could not get that piece of
From
paper.
a large international regulatory agency that they didn't fill out the form, and so they couldn't deploy the people.
Right. So
So can we agree that's stupid?
yes.
Let's agree that's stupid, right? Can we agree that's stupid, people? Okay, good.
But I really don't think it would be that hard to do some of these tabletop exercises, drills, after action review, whatever you want to call it, and you bring in a diverse group of people, and it's a true working session. It's not a conference. It's a working meeting to say, let's imagine such and such a scenario occurs. What information are you going to need, company X? Who are you going to get that from, FDA? Are you ready to provide that? Do we have somebody who can weigh in from ASPR on emergency use authorization? But there's all these sort of things that could
what's
happen.
ASPR?
The Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and
Okay.
Response. So if you're going to move,
I hope no one's rolling their eyes that I asked that question, but
yeah, but if you're going to move product
yeah.
to some part of the world that doesn't have an FDA approval, it's infinitely more complex. You're going to need to have some stakeholders at the table. But there's a lot of unglamorous things that would make a dramatic difference in response time, and we very rarely sit down and actually walk through those. And I love this idea of a strike force, by the way, that was brought up yesterday. It's a phenomenal idea. One of the things that strike force could think about is sort of some of these logistical issues in addition to the medical piece.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier, so could I just get, you're in the pharma business, so there's some folks that don't like pharmaceutical companies. So what's your response to people? There may be folks in this audience that are like, I don't like pharmaceutical companies. So because I think that's probably one of the elephants in the room. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely true. And I think one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest challenges we face is the lack of trust across sectors, right? We heard it last night at dinner when the speaker was talking about the lack of trust between countries. We also have the lack of trust between public and private. Now, what's interesting about my career is, as I mentioned, I've had a chance to sit on both sides of the table. So the first time I went into work at CMS, which is Medicare and Medicaid, I had a very rosy view of how delightful pharmaceutical companies are and the amazing things that they do. I didn't have to be there too long to interact with a couple of very aggressive drug companies who clearly didn't understand sort of the disease.
Charge like $1,000 a vaccine shot or something?
So I guess you say
Right.
trust is earned. I've been on both sides, and I've seen companies I wouldn't want to work with. I think you got to give everyone a fair shot, and we absolutely have got to create networks to build stronger relationships. I was fortunate to be in the program that Johns Hopkins has, that some of you may be aware of, for emerging leaders in biosecurity. It's a phenomenal program, and you get to know people differently when you're working on a project, when you're going out for a drink, and then you have that relationship over time. The problem is we don't have enough of those programs, and they're often targeted at lower level or younger employees. We need a formal rotation program for people who have more senior experience so that you can socialize and share some of that knowledge across different agencies, whether it's the Department of Defense, the CDC, the FDA, a vaccine company. But again, I would put that back on us. There's absolutely no reason we couldn't create that program right now. So we talk about these things a lot. I would argue that we should actually try to create it. And it shouldn't be entry level.
Walker, talk a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. Guy, can I come back to you about Guinea? You're the foundation that has in Europe it's a family foundation, but it's also the namesake of a pharmaceutical company. So you all do work not just during pandemics, but during when there aren't pandemics, and you do work on strengthening health systems in your work. Could you talk about? Do you get pushback because you're a sort of a private family foundation that does stuff? Do people sort of say, "Oh, you're that pharmaceutical company"? Do they confuse you with the pharmaceutical company? A, and B, does the brand of your family foundation is that a problem for your ability to get your work done?
I would say no, because the Mérieux family, the companies of the Mérieux family are not really pharma companies.
Okay.
They are diagnostic companies which are less suspect, I would say,
Okay.
than pharma companies.
That's very interesting. You use the word suspect with pharma companies. I suspect there are other folks in the room that probably over coffee whisper that term, right?
Which is completely inadequate.
It's an inadequate term.
For sure.
Okay.
So the Mérieux name is more an advantage than a disadvantage in that case because of the history of the family, which is known at least in France and in Europe, and we don't have pushback from the governments, from the communities in the countries where we are present and the projects we are doing. It is more difficult for us to make other funding agencies and the government agencies understand that we cannot support all of our activities. We are a relatively small foundation with a lot of projects, but we need to partner with others. We need to partner with financial agencies.
Do you work with AFD, the French aid agency?
We work with AFD, which
this is like the USAID of France.
It's the same the same kind of agency, and
do you work with any do you work with the Gates Foundation or?
We work with the Gates Foundation, but it's sometimes not very easy because if we are compared to the Gates Foundation, we don't have the same resources to
So people think you're made of money and don't want to give you money. Is that what the problem is?
That's a problem we have. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So could you just spend a minute? Let's just talk about. So you're in Guinea. It's a francophone country. This is Dan's simplistic understanding. There were 3 countries in the Ebola crisis. There was Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And so the Brits got Sierra Leone. The Americans had Liberia, and the French had Guinea. Now, now you can tell me I'm wrong, but that's just Dan's simplistic understanding of this. So could you just run the playbook of what happened? You get a phone call saying there's an Ebola outbreak in Guinea. What did your foundation do in response to, given that you had been on the ground probably a long time in Francophone Guinea, you probably already had a network of relationships with the government, you were probably already had, what changed in the kind of work that you did? How did your work change in Guinea when the outbreak of Ebola happened?
So I think the first thing we did, and the most important thing, is to reach out to the Ministry of Health there and understand what are their capacity to respond to the crisis, and it was very weak at that time for sure. The other thing is that there are a number of partners, technical partners, that were ready to act, and sometimes duplicating the things. It's not only in Guinea, but it was also in countries surrounding these 3 countries where there was the crisis.
So people are doing the same thing at the same time, doing
Yeah.
duplication of effort.
Yeah, so
I'm sure that's not, no one else can identify with that in here, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the very important thing is to coordinate the different partners under the umbrella of
And who did that role in Guinea? Did the government do that? Did WHO do that? Or did WAHO or Wahoo? It's not Wahoo, right? It's Wahoo.
it's WAHO, yeah.
Right, Wahoo. So did Wahoo do that role or fail to do that role? I always got the sense that WHO got really bad marks in the Ebola
Yeah,
crisis.
yeah.
So who coordinated who played quarterback in Guinea?
Well, it was not very well coordinated from the beginning to the end of the crisis. So it's something that we have to improve, and that's when we work regularly in our routine activities that we can prepare for that. We can identify who is in a position to coordinate the activity.
Who should coordinate in Guinea in your mind? Who should have coordinated?
WHO, I think, with the government.
And they failed.
And they failed, yes. They failed at least at the beginning, and then progressively, and that's why this Ebola crisis could be solved.
Are they in a position to, if there was another Ebola outbreak today in Guinea, would the WHO or WAHO be in a position to coordinate today?
Yeah, I think it's better, yeah, because many actors went in Guinea during the crisis and stayed there and helped the government to improve their capacities to respond to a new crisis. So now I think it's better organized, and I hope that the government, with the help of WHO there, will be able to cope a new crisis if
Right,
it happens.
just humor me just a little bit further. I just want to push just a little bit further on this. So my understanding was that there were a lot reduction of airplane flights into Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
There were banks stopped opening. I think Guinea has a significant mining industry. Did the mining industry shut down as well? Did those things start to happen in Guinea as the disease broke out further? Did those things happen in Guinea when Ebola happened? Like there were less flights,
Yeah,
less
sure.
banking, less mining operations?
Sure. Especially the flights. Many companies stopped their flights, and it was very difficult to go to Guinea when you are a professional, a health professional, and come back to your country. At that time, I was working in Cameroon, and we had experts that we wanted to send to reinforce the capacities.
Right.
But if they go there, then they have to stay 21 days in quarantine before coming back to their country.
So who wants to do that?
This is a problem.
That sound like a fun. Not too many people want to sign up for that.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
What I want to come back to. I think this case study of Guinea is very, very interesting. Thank you, Guy. Okay, so Barry, thank you for being on this panel again. So I'm just talk a little bit more about. You have this joint venture with the government. You have this capacity to create 50 million vaccines. Is the technology change? Talk about some of the changes in technology that are coming. Are we going to be able to produce 50 million vaccines for some outbreaks? Will not be enough. I mean, there's several other.
Well, that's the first 12 weeks.
That's the first 12 weeks, right?
Yeah, so it's not a capacity issue. But you said, we were talking earlier, one of the problems that we all face in this group is that we don't finish what we start a lot of times. So if you take the model that we showed we could produce that many vaccines, and there are multiple technologies that can do these kinds of things. We do it in plants, others do it in other technologies. But what happened, I asked DARPA, how are you going to get it to the people? Well, yeah, you're going to make all the vaccines. And,
Just call Amazon.
Yeah, well, we
Right?
did a simulation at the company, and I will tell you, I'll say this to anybody in the room, there is no single place that is prepared right now to deliver large quantities of materials, even if they have the technical abilities, because they can't afford to staff and be ready for it. So when we talk about how we would act in a pandemic in the United States here, we talked about finance, cash, supply chain, housing for people, safety of our workers, energy, all those logistical things. It's a huge undertaking. So one of the things I did at DARPA, as I suggested to DARPA, is we designed a mobile clean room because we had GCON, the company that makes the autonomous clean rooms. That was one of my companies. And it fit on a C-17, and you could put 100 million doses in bulk aboard that and fly it to a place where you had a reverse filler that would go to high pressure inoculation systems that people in moon suits could use. And you could distribute hundreds and hundreds of thousands in a hot zone rapidly. So did that ever get? No. I mean, there's still no way to fill syringes and fill vials.
The boring stuff.
The boring stuff, yeah. It's that make it stuff.
The make it stuff.
Yeah.
The
yeah.
make it stuff and the deliver it stuff are still are
Right.
component that we're not. Could you talk, Barry, about? I hear about new technologies like CRISPR and sort of other kinds of new sorts of technologies that might be relevant to vaccines. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the technologies that are on the horizon that you're either aware of or you're around in terms of that they're going to impact either on vaccines or sort of our ability to respond to challenges?
Well, I think that's a two-sided question. One, the technologies we already haven't gotten very far. For example, in South Africa right now, 30% of pregnant women have AIDS.
Terrible.
Of that group, a large percentage will have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma because it's exacerbated by immune-compromised systems. 1% of the people in South Africa have access to rituximab. You and I have it like aspirin almost. I mean, it's available to everybody in the United States.
And is that a failure of the system in terms of?
No,
just
it's an issue of cost and availability. Most drug companies can't afford to sell rituximab, even at drastic discounts in South Africa and in China. So what we have done is taken our technology, which is a lower capital base business than CHO cells and bioreactors and all of that, and we're teaching those people to manufacture in their countries, in their own economic systems, and that makes some sense.
So we need different business models and
Yeah,
different
it's not that
manufacturing approaches.
we have technology. We have a surfeit of technology. It's getting the basics of manufacturing and self-empowerment to other countries and regions is really the first line of defense.
Okay, so what you're saying is there's lots of technologies, but the business we're going to have to rethink business models or approaches
and a
given country context.
B2B business-to-business model is pretty good. Now, we have two small businesses. We just announced a collaboration in China last week on, the Brian Beagle and the KTBX and KAGS were all over it. It was a big event here. I did get a phone call from somebody that says, "Why are you doing business with communists?"
The Chi-Coms?
Yeah.
Or the Chi-Coms, right.
So
we're bringing that term back.
But here's a small business in China that is going to make a biobetter rituximab.
Yeah.
And we're just going to teach them how to do it. We're going to help them build a building. And guess what? They pay us to do that. What a concept. It's actually profitable for both companies, without the intervention of the USG.
Barry, let me just ask about the issue of intellectual property. It seems to me that's one of the issues in the health community that's a hot button issue is, okay, well, I'm a pharmaceutical company or I'm a technology company. I create some patented technology and I have a price point I'm selling it at. And what I'm hearing you say, how do you deal with issues of intellectual property in some of these really pressing situations?
We make it a good business deal. And that's not being cavalier about it. It's what's the incentives on both sides. IP is one thing, know-how is a very big thing.
Okay.
So what you really are doing is teaching know-how. And this has been, if you go back to South Africa, for example, I was told when we went to South Africa that you're never going to be successable because you aren't politically connected and you need to know this guy.
You need to pay bribes or something.
Yeah, and we don't do that. So
right.
So that just ticks me off when I hear something like that.
And you've been successful there.
Yeah, so we went last year and we put on a symposium for 50 scientists at our expense. We're not a big company. Jerry came along, and it was hugely successful, where we found that in country there were labs that were working on specific vaccines for the region using plant-made pharmaceuticals, so they just didn't know how to manufacture them. So we went back again this year for the 3rd year, and they go, "You're back." Well, yeah, we're back. Well, the problem is carpetbaggers have gone into these countries trying to make a quick buck, extort money from countries that don't have money. So our business model is, we'll teach you how to do it. You'll have to pay us for the reagents and the hardware that we're going to do to empower you. And then when you are successful, we'll take a buck off of that, and it'll be great.
So,
It's not a bad deal.
so Richard, there have been several things I wanted to ask you about as folks have been talking. One is this issue of trust. I'm sure you see it all the time in other sectors. Could you talk about that? Barry talked about different business models and some of the issues with that. And then Guy talked about some of the issues of like who's in charge and who's coordinating. And could you just reflect a little bit, because you do this all the time in other sectors. Each of these issues comes up in other contexts that you've worked in.
Yeah, if I could start with the other business models point, and also picking up on both something that Barry said and that Rebecca said, if you want to engage with the private sector, you need to engage with the private sector. That means you need to understand what it looks like in different countries, in different contexts, and who does what. How many people in the room have heard of JD.com?
What's that?
Okay, so JD.com, there's one gentleman in the back, thank you. JD.com is the 3rd largest internet company in the world, works out of China. It's sort of like if you combined Amazon with FedEx and with PayPal all into one. They guarantee delivery. If you order something before 11 o'clock in the morning, they guarantee delivery to 99% of China, including rural areas, by 11 o'clock at night. If you order it after 11 o'clock at night, they deliver it by 11 o'clock the following morning. After 11 o'clock in the morning, they deliver it by 11 o'clock the following day. They use drones. They've actually figured out how to use drones.
I wanted to come back to the issue of drones. I want to ask everyone about the issue of drones after you talk about this. Yeah.
My point being, again, I think when we were looking at dealing with, we brought a bunch of companies together during Ebola response. The critical issue was one of last mile logistics. How do you get the stuff, the last mile? And there are companies that do that are actually on the ground in those countries that are dealing with those issues, but they're not names we will have heard of. They're names that you will have to go and find out and figure out. So there's that issue. Like I loved Rebecca's suggestion of a single point of contact for private sector engagement. I know USAID is considering just such an innovation. I'd like to see that in more places in government. At the same time, what I'd love to see is more people in government and more people in the NGO community taking a really deep interest in how the private sector works and helping to find business models. If it can be done through a market-based mechanism or can be done with a private sector actor or actor that exists, that's better than trying to create a new actor. So really deeply studying those things and figuring them out. With trust, trust is something, as Rebecca said, needs to be earned. It's not something that's just granted. And there are definitely bad actors, but most of our systems of engagement presume a bad actor. They don't presume a positive actor.
I would posit in this community, they presume, I'm sorry to say this, I think a lot of the public health community presumes the pharmaceutical companies are bad actors. I would posit that's an operating assumption.
Well, I think most.
I think it's unfair, but I think that's an operating assumption.
And most government ethics policies and things like that presume bad actors and are set up to deal with bad actors. I think we need more informal convenings like this one, more informal convenings where we bring people together to build up the sinews and muscle memory of trust. One small thing, people build capacities for trust and get to know each other by breaking bread together, spending time together. Most government entities can't pay for food and drink. So we need other actors to come in and
or under $20.
Pay for the food and drink so that we can actually get together and get to know each other. A friend of mine said you don't need to have alcohol to have a good time, but you also don't need a computer to do your work. It certainly makes it easier if you have them to get to know each other and to get to that kind of level of trust. So it takes meetings, it takes getting together, it takes working together side by side. And then what was your third question?
There was issues of business models. We talked about who's in charge.
Who's in charge? Gosh, that's a tough one, and I don't have a single answer for that.
Okay.
I think that's one where it's very context specific, very country specific.
Okay, so I want to come back to this issue of drones, and then I have a question for everybody. I want to go to questions. Everyone, I want to go to questions for the audience. Okay, so I want everyone. I say the word drones. What's your response to the word drones from where you are? Because I could think of, okay, it seems to me that even from 5 years ago, the emergence of technologies of drones is different than the breakout of Ebola 5 years ago. The level of technological advancement in drones and delivering stuff is a lot more advanced, and I think 5 years from now it'll be even more advanced. So could I ask if I say the word drones, does anyone have a reaction to that word? Other than like it's overwrought, it's overblown, or it's a thing? Rebecca?
Well, my take on it might be different. Certainly, I think about it from a positive distribution perspective. I also, just given where I work, think about it from a negative perspective and how it could be used to deliver a
Bad
weaponized pathogen.
Oh, God.
So I sort of look at it on
Oh
both sides.
boy, thanks for that downer.
Oh,
but
and
yeah,
we
you're
hear
right.
a
You're
lot
right.
of countries looking at
You're right. Thank you. You're right, though. Okay, Guy, if I say the word drones to you, what's your response to drones?
Well, the transporting specimens from remote places to be tested in laboratories is a very big issue in many countries. The roads are not good. Part of the time they cannot be used. So probably drones will play a role sending specimens to central laboratories or to province hospitals where
Or
they
even
can be tested.
maybe last mile even into
Yeah.
villages?
Well, it can be in districts which can organize them to spend
Okay.
specimens even from quite remote villages. Yes.
Barry, if I say the word drones, what's your response to that?
Well, in this context, we think about it as cold chain management. You could get things to people rapidly in areas that aren't accessible by aircraft or
Okay.
transport, and keep it cold fast enough to get it dispensed.
Okay, so I'm going to put two questions to you. You pick one, and then I'm going to go to the questions. Okay, big data, or what do you need from government? Pick. You can't answer both. Big data. If I say the word big data, what's your response to big data in this conversation? Because we haven't discussed big data. Big data, or what do you need from government? So I'll start with you, Richard.
So I'll take the big data one and say, I guess, two things about it. Not just big data, but open data. And this also does kind of answer the question about what we need from government. One of the things that we're seeing is that there's a lot of data being collected, but nobody really knows how that data is being used. And I would love to see governments and donors who mandate the sharing of data with all privacy and IP and all of the kinds of protections taken care of, but some way of central repositories of data where multiple people can look at that data, act on that data, and think about that data. So I'd like to see that written into grants and see that written into procurements.
Okay, Barry, big data, or what do you need from government?
I'll take the government one. Two things. One, it has to be easier to do business with government. The FAR is an absolute impediment.
The FAR, for all of you, everyone knows what this is?
It's the regulations around acquisitions.
The horrible acquisition.
So a company like ours would have to hire another 30% on our accounting staff to qualify to get a federal grant, or deal with BARDA, or deal with DARPA, or we don't have to do that with DARPA. That's the key. Just figure out how DARPA funds things, and everybody should do that, and life would be a lot better. Secondly, and I've changed my mind after the last 2 years, what I need from government now is to get the hell out of the way and not make it hard for us to do business.
Okay.
For example, our Chinese collaborators last week applied for visas a month and a half ago and didn't get them until 2 days after the conference that we had set. Come on.
I mean, come on, it's stupid.
Give me a break. That is.
You can run that across dozens of countries, and yep, fair enough. Thank you. Okay, Guy, big data, or what do you need from government?
Big data, but in fact, sharing data is something which is very important for the surveillance and the preparedness to pandemics, and that's something which is absolutely not well organized in many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a need to connect laboratories, clinical centers together to exchange this data, which will be very informative to everybody, including companies that work on new vaccines, etc. So more than big data, we have to think about sharing existing data in the countries.
Okay, thank you. Big data, or what do you need from government?
Government, recognize the companies aren't the same, recognize they need a seat at the table. We want to be part of drills or tabletop exercises. We need clarity and communication about what you need from us. I also think we need to model best practices. Some of you heard from Tyler, who was up on a panel yesterday talking from BARDA. BARDA is a great organization to work with from our perspective as a private sector company, because they don't require a ton of paperwork. When we do something for BARDA, we can fill it out in a couple pages, takes a few hours, you can send it in. By comparison, another agency we work with, to your point, 750 man hours to create a proposal, not a contract, just a proposal to say we're interested in working with them. There's no reason we couldn't take what the practices that BARDA has put in place and use those across different agencies.
Thank you. Okay, I want to hear from Q&A. I do want to hear from Dennis Carroll, though, first, because Dennis, I want you to come on down here. So Dennis, please come on down. So Dennis, you are a friend of mine and someone I really admire at AID. So I want you to answer the question, what does AID need from the private sector? What do you need from the private sector? You think about these big challenges of pandemics. You've listened to this conversation. What do you can thank me for cold calling you later,
Well,
but
Daniel,
what
thank
do
you
you,
very much for the cold call.
yeah.
Look, I'm sitting here, I love this discussion. And so it's not what I need. I think what we're hearing is what the private sector needs. Look, the role of government is to enable. We don't do a very good job of it. But if we're successful, everything we're talking about is a whole of society requirement. When we're talking about pandemics, we heard it from the commissioner this morning. When there's a pandemic, Texas is on its own. And they're going to have to harness all of the capabilities within Texas to be able to respond, because Washington, D.C. is going to be hunkered down around Washington, D.C. So I think this issue of opening up this dialogue is an incredible one. And for USAID, look, I mean, from my perspective, we're only as good as we're able to deliver. And we don't deliver anything. It's our implementing partners who do the delivery. Our role is to enable. And I said yesterday, Andrew was a great administrator, because Andrew fundamentally was a great enabler. And so, the issues about what the FARs, God forbid, get thee behind me, right? You're right. We need to figure out a way of creating a partnership that has government as, it has a public function, enabling the public good to be realized. But it doesn't do it, it enables it, and you are the doer. So that's my take home. Okay?
Thank you.
And you need to have another dialogue. And you need to have a late night show.
I do need to have a late night show. I do. You're right. Thank you, Dennis. Okay. All right, sir.
Yeah, Lester Martinez. I preside over something called the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortia. It's 250 members, academia, industry, big industry, big pharma, everybody's in the mix. Operates outside the FAR under a law called OTA, Other Transaction Agreements. So that means no requirements for financial DoD compliant systems, financial systems, no need for government is just a member, kind of the consortia. So the process is one white paper, typical in the calls. Government can talk to the member and say, in the third paragraph, you meant to say this, right? The government can shape the proposal at the white paper stage. It can even shape it at the final proposal if you consider someone to be, to have the right answer. So government is engaged all the way through. We can bring industry, and we have done that. We can bring foundations, we have done that. So we can mix the monies. We put it in the pot because we're a non-for-profit, so we can mix all that. There is no contracts. The contract is between the member and the consortia. So you have to have compliance systems, financials.
Sure.
But you have to have, but not the DoD craziness. So, because by the way, you cannot even protest a grant, because as a member, you agreed not to do that. So all that nonsense that sometimes you get stale for months on end, if not for years, is out the window. If the government likes, we work on a prototype site, so it's advanced development, either prototype, a drug, a new device, a new software, or something that is at that stage. If the government likes what the government sees, they don't have to compete it, they can buy it. So many of the issues you've been talking about how
difficult
it is to deal within the FAR, Congress realized that and allowed us to work on a different model. And by the way, my institution work Army, Navy, Air Force, but I can work NIH, we can work any single agency of the government. We already have the consortia, so for some of you that are in the business, look us up in the MTEC.
NPEC.
No, NT, Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium.
Okay.
So the website is M like in Mike, T like in Tango, E like in Echo, and C like in Charlie, / S like in Sierra, C like in Charlie.org. And you see the membership. The other thing we do too,
Okay.
and we have done this, just
Okay.
and last, but just to give you an idea of the power of the tool.
And that's sort of my point. The OTAs are phenomenal. You know, we're part
So
of
other
one.
transaction agreements. So these are. Yeah. Right.
Well, it's other transaction authority. The
Other
problem,
transaction
though, is
authority.
that not all agencies have the authority to do an OTA. So
Or
that's
use
my
them.
point. So OTAs are phenomenal. BARDA
Well-
can do it. You know, we need to spread that across.
Okay, so let me just get a reaction from the panel to your point about other transaction agreements that are maybe your point is there are a variety of workarounds to some of the challenges of the FAR and the procurement system, and that's true.
Yeah.
So can I get so Rebecca, you had a view on this,
So-
but I'd like to hear from the others as well too.
Just
But
really briefly, I mean, two thoughts there. One, there are great examples like that one and DARPA and others. And a colleague of mine said, what we need to do is take some of these islands and make them peninsulas, where we need to connect that kind of thinking into the mainstream of it, of what how procurements are done. The second part of that, though, is that at USAID, as an example, they have other transaction authority, but they never use it.
or rarely use it.
Very rarely use it, because if you're an agreements officer or a contracting officer, the risk-reward curve is flat. There is no reward for taking risk. And as a result, you need to have an overwhelming evidence base that would say it's worth it to go try to do this in a non-traditional way. So we somehow need to deal with that fact and make it easier and more acceptable for contract officers and agreements officers to actually approve OTAs.
I'm just cognizant of the time. How are we doing on time? When do you need to cut me off?
One question, and then I think we
Okay, this gentleman here, please.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Dr. Ego from Guinea. I am the country director for Guinea.
Okay.
So
Are
I
you
wa-
in charge in Guinea?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good, good.
So
We figured it out.
I want to compliment what Guy was mentioning here about coordination in Guinea, because personally I've been in Guinea from the beginning during the outbreak time and up to recently I was in Guinea. And I think it's important to recognize that, of course, there was some coordination issues at the beginning of the outbreak, but some improvements, a lot of things have been done, from the creation of the National Coordination Cell for Ebola Response, which at the end have been turned in the National Agency of Health Safety, which is currently working in country, ensuring that the surveillance of all the epidemic-prone disease is being done. So we have also to recognize that at the beginning there are a lot of donors, a lot of partners in Guinea. Like when I was talking with the national coordinator, he had by then 58 partners, and each partners with his implementing plan, and each partners with his mandate, and each partners with a different donor, and each donor has its own priority, and it becomes, in that context, it becomes very difficult to coordinate. And some of those priorities, sometimes, they don't consider a holistic approach in a way that they target a single item, a single action. Like talking about Fondation Mérieux, we're talking about laboratory. When you talk about laboratory, it's a wide thing, like looking at specimen collection, specimen transport, specimen storage, the testing at the laboratory, the quality assessment to the laboratory, and that means it's really a big thing. And if we target just one element in this overall package, definitely other partners will have to come to do to complement the package, and that's where you see a lot of overlaps in terms of on the ground. So my question here is to really understand how possible that donors can sometimes also do some coordination. We talked yesterday about sector coordination, but I think strongly feel that donors have also to coordinate in a way that on the ground, every partner wants to implement because they have resources to do the job. They are answerable to the donor and to the communities, and everyone wants to do. And that's where you see partners are really pushing, struggling to see how they can implement on the ground. So there's this need of a huge coordination among the donor community as well to ensure that at least on the ground, people are at ease. And the other thing is, when you look at all different actions that are proposed, sometimes they are developed far away from the country where they have to be implemented in a way that they don't align to the national strategic plan. And when you come in the country, you have already an approved proposal, you need to struggle. And the question is, we have deliverables that have to be met, and we need to follow them through, but unfortunately they're not aligned to what are the priorities of the country. And every partners would like to force and see how best they can do. And that's where you see that people are struggling and a lot of overlap comes in. That means this coordination among donor communities is very important. And coming to the partner, the private sector, because I'm very interested because I saw the vaccine, and Guinea was very welcoming for the vaccine trials, and that's where they did this. But the question I was asking myself was, we had different vaccines. Like there is the Merck vaccine, which is being used by different partners, but on the other side, you see another partners like the German also to come with the vaccine in the same country and targeting the same population. It becomes a bit confusing, a lot of struggle, competition around the client who have to get the vaccines. So is there a way also that the private companies coordinate also among themselves so that at least to put a simple ease to the communities? Because when we see a lot of competition on the ground, and that's where sometimes the population, they have a lot of misconception, a lot of mistrust because of the way, the approaches which are being used by this and that other partners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. How much time do we have? 2 minutes?
Not much. Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes.
So I want to ask, Richard, can I ask you first to respond to this? I'd like to hear from Guy and then either Barry or Rebecca. The brief responses, extra credit if it's under 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So just as an example, I totally agree. I would love to give that person a round of applause for calling for donor coordination.
And by the way, can we give a round of applause to the 3 West African country governments who actually stopped Ebola, please?
On donor coordination, I would say it's not just a matter of coordinating across multiple donors. I was just helping one single donor coordinate all of their grants to within one single disease issue. And it turns out there were like 7 grantees who were working in the same country, didn't know each other existed. The grantor didn't know that either, by the way. So we need to see more donor coordination. And I think one of the fundamental things there is, I call it falling in love with the problem before you fall in love with the solution. I see most often both donors coming to the table thinking they know what the answer is already, and the implementers and the applicants thinking they know what the answer is as well. I would love to see people really focus in and try to decide what are the problem areas they want to work on, then get the donors together that are working in that like-minded area and come up with singular packages to go out.
Okay, Guy, very briefly, please.
I think there are very good examples of coordination of donors and international organizations that should be copied for the preparedness of pandemics. Gavi, the Global Fund, and now CEPI are organizations where multiple donors coordinate to have an efficient action. And we see that in the countries with the vaccination of children, which has been largely improved with the treatment, which is more accessible to patients living with the HIV. So why not doing that for pandemic preparedness? And for diagnostics.
Okay, Rebecca or Barry, one of you want to speak?
I'll say one thing very briefly about South Africa. What we did to begin with is surveyed the assets that were there to start with before we decided what business model we were going to enter into. And we found good assets. For example, a finish and fill company that was functional. We didn't have to build that. So again, it's a B2B sort of thing. But we did that, and we were very pleased to find assets in the country.
Thank you. Rebecca, you get the last word.
I'm in violent agreement. I think we need focus and alignment.
Okay, thank you.